Welcome to Washington in Focus Daily. It is Thursday, May 21st, 2026. I'm Carleen Johnson, the Center Square's state government reporter. And in today's episode of Washington in Focus, the DCYF, Department of Children, Youth, and Families Oversight Board, met in Olympia with an update today from DCYF Secretary Tana Sen. You may recall there was a recent audit, findings that came from State Auditor Pat McCarthy, that showed about $37 million of questionable, maybe overpayments to daycare providers receiving subsidies. Not fraud, they say, but overpayments or other questionable spending. Well, today, that update from Tana Sen, we went to Olympia, my colleague Tim Clauser and I, hoping to be able to interview Secretary Sen in person because we've been unable to have that opportunity. So we'll bring the update in today's episode of Washington in Focus. And then Longview's superintendent, the Longview School District superintendent, was today arrested. There have been months of a months-long investigation, I should say, from the Longview Police Department into allegations of sexual assault involving the boys' basketball team. Well, according to police, the superintendent of the district has gone out of her way, they allege, to basically stonewall on the investigation, maybe cover things up, maybe order some other staff members not to really be open and transparent about all of this. Well, today that led to her arrest, and there is another arrest forthcoming. And then my colleagues TJ Martinell and Tim Clauser on the communications from the state AG's office and crafters of the income tax. These are the exclusive emails that we obtained unredacted of communications between Senator Jamie Pedersen and the AG's office for months. And our attempts have been to press members of the state Supreme Court as well, based on the records that we obtained. And TJ and I were at the state Supreme Court on Monday this week for a swearing in ceremony and got an opportunity to approach Chief Justice Debra Stevens about this. So we'll share more on that in today's episode. So I concede the day was a little disappointing for me today. I had hoped to see DCYF Secretary Tana Sen in person and basically say, I've been trying to get you for nearly 6 months now for an interview. I'm not able to make that happen. Can you please answer our questions? We have been since the end of December investigating local daycares, home daycare providers receiving, in some cases, inexplicably large taxpayer subsidies. $20,000, $30,000 a month or more, many of them, and many of the ones that we have visited, there's been no evidence of a daycare. So I was hoping, knowing that Tana Sen was going to be giving an update today to the DCYF Oversight Board, that I'd have a chance to press her in person and say, what's going on, and can we please sit down and have an in-person interview? I want to share with you what I have seen and uncovered with my own work, and I want you to respond to that. Unfortunately, she gave her update to the oversight board remotely today instead of appearing in person. Her office is just a couple of blocks away. I'm not sure why she wasn't there in person. Nonetheless, this was part of what she shared today to the oversight board about that recent audit.
The conversation that was out in the community and out in the public was really tough on a lot of our childcare providers who do incredible work with our children and families. And again, while we welcome audits and we welcome questions that we can answer, we want to have a good use of our state dollars. We also recognize that that was really very stressful for childcare providers, and I think a lot felt like they were under attack, probably for no very good reason. And, just again, already on a hard business and a very important resource for our state and our families. That was an unfortunate byproduct. And we acknowledge that and just want to express our gratitude to all the childcare providers who continue to do amazing work with our kids and families.
So takeaways for me based on what she presented to the oversight board was that, the auditor finding this $37 million in potential overpayments, not fraud, she says, was an extrapolation. They weren't real hard data. They didn't look at all of the providers receiving subsidies in the state of Washington. So that was kind of my first takeaway from her comments, and you just saw part of those there, but it went, probably a 20-minute presentation in all. And she talked about how media reports and social media discussion has led to creating anxiety in the daycare community. And then after her comments, one of the members of the board, Lois Martin, actually said it's been more than anxiety, it's been death threats on providers. Now, I have followed up with the DCYF Oversight Board today asking for show me those specific examples. If they've received reports from providers who've been investigated or just had their front door knocked on, those folks have received death threats. I want to receive that information. Certainly, our intention in all of the reporting we've done in the last 6 months on this was never to intimidate, harass, or threaten anyone. It was simply to knock on the door and say, is there an actual daycare here? And if you've watched previous episodes or seen any of our reporting on this in the last 6 months, you can see that in most cases, many of the ones that we visited, there was no evidence of an actual daycare on the property. In some cases, the place is actually boarded up, or no one comes to the door, and maybe police are called on you for simply investigating and asking questions. I should also note that a couple of members of that oversight board, I spoke with them after today's meeting, including Senator Nikki Torres, who was very frustrated that the amount of time allotted for the auditor's report today from Secretary Sen was given a very limited amount of time. It was a 3+ hour meeting. They actually adjourned early, but the auditor's section was given very limited time, and oversight board members really were allowed to ask very limited questions. I mean, that's their job. This is the oversight board for DCYF. And she shared a lot of frustration, as did another member who said he will be speaking shortly with the chair of the board, Senator Claire Wilson of Federal Way, to say, we need to conduct these meetings in a more efficient, effective way. If we're really going to be the oversight board, let us ask the questions. Give us time to hear an adequate response. If we're going to make anything better, that's how these things should be conducted. And now the millionaire's tax enacted by the legislature this session, right at the conclusion of the 2026 legislative session, contains some language in there making it necessary for the implementation of the budget, thereby attaching a referendum proof clause to it. Well, when the Center Square obtained exclusive documents, unredacted documents, 988 pages of emails between crafters of the income tax, namely Senator Jamie Pedersen, and the Office of Attorney General Nick Brown, there was a lot revealed there in how they kind of went back and forth and what was the best way to preclude a vote of the people. Well, this week, TJ Martinell and I attended a swearing in ceremony at the state Supreme Court for newly sworn in Justice Theo Angeles. We went in hopes of getting an opportunity to perhaps ask some questions of Governor Bob Ferguson about the documents we have obtained, and also Chief Justice Debra Stevens. She was there. Well, TJ and I did get an opportunity to approach her. There was after the swearing in ceremony for the new Justice Theo Angeles, there was kind of a little meet and greet reception area just outside the courtroom afterwards. So she came out, and my colleague TJ Martineau was able to approach her and ask her. She kind of didn't really offer a lot in a response, but it was interesting based on the documents we have received. So here's part of TJ Martinell's conversation in a podcast recorded with my other colleague, Tim Clauser, expanding more on what we got and didn't get from Chief Justice Debra Stevens.
Welcome to another episode of Washington in Focus. I'm your host, Tim Klauser, with the Center Square's Washington State investigative reporter, TJ Martinell, here to talk about a new Supreme Court justice joining the state's high court. Theo Angeles was sworn in earlier this week. TJ Martinell was there, got to speak to some of the other justices about some ongoing drama around the state's new income tax. TJ, why don't you tell us a little bit about your interactions there, especially with Chief Justice Debra Stevens, given their recent ruling?
Yeah, so I tried to have a conversation with her about a couple of records that I received from the Attorney General's office. I actually got it from the Secretary of State's office, but it was an AGO draft response to Let's Go Washington's lawsuit against the Secretary of State, trying to get a referendum on the millionaire's tax. And the millionaire's tax, which was enacted this legislative session, had a necessity clause in it, which was put in there after Solicitor General Noah Purcell suggested it prior to the legislative session in order to prevent a referendum. So in the draft response that the AGO was working on, Carl Smith, who was the Deputy Solicitor General and a former state Supreme Court clerk, he speculated that allowing the people to vote via referendum on the millionaire's tax would be an attractive option for some justices who want to punt on the constitutional question. So I was trying to ask Chief Justice Stevens, what are her thoughts on a former clerk for her court speculating that her court might rule on this issue, not based on case law or legal precedent, but out of political convenience. And I really didn't get a chance to ask that question, and I really didn't get a chance to read what Carl Smith wrote. I think there was initially some confusion about what I was asking her about, because she thought I was going to ask her about the ongoing lawsuit that's currently active. So she said she couldn't discuss it. And then I explained, and this is all in the video. You guys can watch, the viewers can go read my story. There's a video of me trying to ask her these questions. So I'm just recounting what happened. And then I said, this is about the lawsuit that was for the referendum, and you have already ruled against it. But then I tried to read what Carl Smith wrote, and she said the opinions of the court speak for themselves and didn't want to discuss it any further. So that's pretty much what my very brief interaction. It didn't help to be honest. It didn't help that that lobby, there was a lot of ambiance and noise and echoing, and there's a lot of marble and stuff like that. So it was difficult to have that conversation, but we did try to have it. For context, I reached out to the state Supreme Court twice when I was working on the initial story, because I wanted to discuss it with some of the justices, and I didn't receive a response. So we've definitely tried to get a hold of them to get comment on this matter.
Yeah, and just to clarify for readers a little bit, there's a few different legal challenges going on with the state's new income tax. Now, Let's Go Washington, they had filed an attempt to run a referendum to put it on the ballot for voters, and the state Supreme Court rejected that lawsuit, upholding what they say is years of precedent, saying, look, you can't hold referendums really on tax measures because they're essential for the budget. Now, that lawsuit is separate from another ongoing constitutional challenge in Clickitat County that's expected to reach the court in the next year or so, where they will rule on the constitutional issues of the income tax. Now, there is an initiative effort underway, so we could still see this on a future ballot. But what really matters is going to be who's ruling over the constitutional issues of this, whether or not it's on the ballot, and where those parties might be aligned. Now, earlier this week, TJ, you were there.
Right.
When you talked to Stevens, it was following the swearing in of Theo Angeles. He was appointed by the governor a few months ago, and notably, he worked with the governor at K&L Gates, a law firm that has active contracts with the Attorney General's office. It was years ago, but they did work together. Notably, Colleen Medley used to work under Governor Ferguson when he was the Attorney General at the time. Can you kind of talk about this close-knit group and the potential concerns of having people that worked for the governor, under the governor, who are donating to the governor's campaigns? What kind of issues that raises when these people will also rule on a potentially unconstitutional tax that the governor heavily endorsed?
Yeah, it's actually kind of amazing, and I didn't fully realize this at the time when I was attending the ceremony. I was a little surprised to see Jamie Pedersen there, who Carleen Johnson, our colleague, spoke to and did a story on her conversation with him. Jamie Pedersen's the prime sponsor of the millionaire's tax, and he openly said in emails in the stories I've written about that he wanted to force the court to take up the constitutional question of whether income is property. Courts have always said yes. That means no progressive income tax. I wanted to ask Justice Stevens about that. Just say, you know, a couple feet away from you is a state senator who wants to force your court to take up a constitutional issue. You know, you're a separate branch of government. You're an elected official. How do you feel about a elected official from a separate branch of government trying to force yours to do something in that way? And you know, I obviously just didn't get a chance to talk to her about that. And but here's where we have to break it down. So the reason I'm assuming the reason why Senator Pedersen was there is because he also worked with Theo Angelis at the same law firm as Governor Ferguson. And Coley Melody was hired by Governor Ferguson, I think back in 2015 for the Attorney General's office. So this is somebody who was directly hired by the governor. On top of that, I did a story on how Coley Melody met with Senator Pedersen back in September for reasons that the Attorney General's office says was unrelated to millionaire's tax. But again, she was an attorney meeting with her client because the Attorney General's office has argued that they are the attorney for legislators, even though the Senate and House have their own legal counsel. That argument has been used to redact public records that I've requested of communications between them, which makes it really interesting how I got that 988 pages of unredacted communications in that regard. So that's the level of connection between all these different people, where there's what many people could argue is a conflict of interest. So having Colleen Melody, who used to work on the Attorney General, used to work for the Attorney General's office. She met with Senator Pedersen. He's a former client of hers. He is the prime sponsor of millionaire's tax that is now currently facing a lawsuit where she could be potentially ruling on it. And then you had Theo Angelis, who used to work with the prime sponsor and could also be ruling on that. And he worked with Governor Ferguson, who also had his own income tax proposal that he was looking at this session. So it's very interesting to see the different connections between them. And so, you know, that's kind of that's the context of in which this ceremony occurred. But, you know, we'll see what happens moving forward, because the big question that we're going to have to ask is, does Justice Angelis and does Justice Melody, do they plan to recuse themselves to avoid an appearance of conflict of interest? Because from what I understand, judicial rules of professional conduct, and I don't know if I get the term on that exact term correctly, but they have to avoid an appearance of a conflict of interest. It's not just a actual conflict of interest, just to avoid it. And so the question is, if they're not going to recuse themselves, you know, what are they going to say to people who think that they have been, that they cannot rule over this impartially?
Yeah, in that judicial rule that you're talking about, it does leave it up to the justices themselves to recuse themselves. They have to recognize the conflict of interest and recuse themselves. It's not a decision made by an outside body to recuse a certain justice. But going back to the Pedersen interview at the swearing-in ceremony, I found it particularly interesting that he said, you know, of course, we're state lawmakers. We're consulting with lawyers. Wouldn't the voters want us to consult with lawyers? But the thing here is that the House and Senate, they have their own lawyers. Right. The Attorney General's office is the people's lawyer. They represent the state of Washington, the voters of Washington. And state law says that income is property and that you can't have progressive income taxes like this. Yet you have the AGO, who's supposed to be working for the people, working behind the scenes with state lawmakers to force the court to overturn this nearly 100 years of precedent. It's somewhat alarming to hear him say over and over again, well, we're just consulting with lawyers. Wouldn't you want us to do this? But they have their own lawyers. They're consulting with the people's lawyers.
I think that the difference is, and this is what's very interesting, because I have the emails between the governor's office and the Attorney General's office, and they even noted that Governor Ferguson's office was asking very different questions about the to the Attorney General's office, and the Attorney General's office's personnel were noting, they said, because Pedersen was saying, I want to get to write a bill that will force the court to take up this 1933 court decision. Governor Ferguson's personnel were saying, hey, we're looking at a potential millionaire's tax or high income earner tax, and we want to get a legal memo as to whether it would survive a court ruling. So they're asking a very different question. They're asking, would this survive a court challenge? Would this pass legal scrutiny? So they weren't, the governor's office, the people with the governor's office was not asking, how do we overturn Colleton? They were asking whether or not it would survive a legal challenge. And so that's the difference between that. That's what you would think a normal elected official or someone who's proposing legislation would say is, hey, I'm interested in this law. Would it survive a legal challenge? And then you go consult with your lawyer, or your lawyer says yes or no, maybe, because they also consulted with the governor's office, consulted with the Attorney General's office on the wealth tax that was proposed last year. And so they were looking at, here's all the different areas where it could have legal problems and stuff like that. So that's very different from saying, I want to craft a bill whose primary purpose is to overturn 100 years of legal precedent, and has enormous implications, because if this legal precedent since 1933 is overturned, it means that the legislature can enact a progressive income tax on all Washington residents at any rate with a simple majority vote. I mean, like, look no further than the estate tax. You have a graduated estate tax where the highest rate was 35%. I mean, you could have a very, very high progressive income tax for high income earners, or they could set any rate they want. They could set 10%, they could set 15%, they could set 20%. They could do whatever they want. And so that's where him going to the Attorney General's office saying, I want to, and prior to this, and as a result of these rulings, they would have to go to the voters and go get 2/3 majority of the legislature and 2/3 majority of voters to approve a constitutional amendment to allow a progressive income tax. So instead of going to voters, and this is the part that's it goes back to what Carl Smith said in his draft thing, where he's thought that justices might want to allow referendum. What he's basically saying, and what obviously Noah Purcell was insinuating in his recommendation to have a necessity or emergency clause, is if this gets in front of voters, voters will say no. And this is the question, and I think Senator Pedersen's been asked this question, and I don't think he really answered it, is why not allow voters to weigh in on this via referendum? And, he mentions that the initiative process, but the initiative process is very different from from a referendum. There's a whole set of different things that occur, and people are trying to get, I think it's Let's Go Washington is trying to get the initiative on the ballot for this year, but that's a very different process, and it gives the Attorney General's office more control. The same people who crafted the bill to overturn a court decision are now going to get to write the title for the ballot measure. So, and there's already, I think, a legal challenge going on over that, if I recall correctly. So that's the difference between Governor Ferguson's people going to the Attorney General's office and saying, we want to look at a high income earner tax. We want to get your opinion on whether it would survive a legal challenge. So we can assume that the purpose of the tax was just to levy a tax on high income earners rather than overturn the court decision. So that's really the question to be asked, is how often has the Attorney General's office actively collaborated with a lawmaker to get and it's not just, Senator Pedersen keeps talking about Colleton as if it's the Supreme Court has only weighed in on this issue once 100 years ago, and that's it. The Supreme Court has repeatedly ruled that income is property. I think it was in 1960, the state Supreme Court said it is no longer a question to this court whether income is property. So they're effectively saying, we're done talking about this, and this, and of course, courts can always go back on prior decisions, but they have a really high bar. The Attorney General's office even admitted in their legal memo to the governor's office, if they were to overturn this, they would have to prove that 90-something years worth of legal precedent was harmful and erroneous. And that's a high bar for them. So this goes back to, the appointment of Angelus and Melody is are they going to take that? Is that going to apply? Is that going to be the basis of how they do their ruling if this ever gets in front of the state Supreme Court?
Yeah, it'd definitely be interesting to see how that decision eventually comes out with this close-knit circle. I mean, it was glaringly obvious when you were in the Supreme Court chambers earlier this week, where you had the drafters of the bill, the people that will be fighting on its behalf, the AGO in court, and then the Supreme Court
Sure.
justices all in one place. But TJ, definitely a story that we'll continue to cover, and we appreciate your coverage of this. For readers hoping to catch that story, you can read it at thecentersquare.com. Otherwise, thank you for joining us for another episode of Washington in Focus.
And finally, today, Longview police made an arrest today. This does not happen very often, but they arrested the superintendent of the Longview School District this morning, just before 9:30. And according to a Facebook post from Longview Police, the superintendent, Karen, I might be butchering the pronunciation of her name. It's either Cloninger or Cloninger. I'm not sure which, but according to this post, it says she was arrested on charges of tampering with a witness, a felony, as well as gross misdemeanor charges of failure to report and obstructing a law enforcement officer. They went on to say additional charges are forthcoming for Andrew Schoonover, or it could be Schoonover, pardon me, Executive Director of Student Services for Longview Public Schools, including but not limited to failure to report, which is a gross misdemeanor, and making a false or misleading statement to a public servant, also a gross misdemeanor. Now, this goes back to February of this year, when there was initially reports brought against a couple of players on the boys basketball team at one of the high schools in Longview. And the allegations here are that these older boys sexually assaulted, and there were other things involved against some younger players on the team. Parents in the district have been going to recent school board meetings and speaking out about this. I should note I did reach out to the school board, several school board members, including the president and vice president of the school board today, asking for comment, because last month, despite the public outcry about the superintendent in the district, they upped her contract, re-signed her contract. So that's going to be something we're following up on. But the allegations here are very serious. The allegations being that the superintendent either obstructed their investigation. I've seen some of the other reports online from some parents, basically, that she is alleged to have obstructed other staff members and told them, don't talk about this. This is not something we're talking about this. And so very serious allegations with the arrest of a superintendent in the Longview School District today. Much more on this to come in the days ahead. That's it for today's episode of Washington in Focus Daily. As always, thank you so much for watching. Hope you'll join us again tomorrow.